to Control Talk Now. My name is Eric Stromquist, and you're watching Control Talk Now, your smart buildings videocast and podcast for the week ending August 13th, 2023. This is episode 423, where we talk about all things HVAC and smart building controls, including sales and marketing. I am so glad you're here. I've got a great guest coming on in just a few minutes. His name is Osman Saleem, and let me tell you something, man, he is dialed into cybersecurity, so you're not going to want to miss that. But before we get to that, man, it was a great week last week. I want to tell you what I was up to. I went to the Johnson Controls Customers Business Conference, and let me tell you, it was off the chain. It was in Milwaukee. Rick Van Buren, Jane Walmsley, great job, you guys. You knocked it out of the park. About 350 people there. Customers of Johnson Controls from all around the globe, people from Latin America. And Johnson Controls, as usual with these conferences, knocked it out of the park. So well done. Hey, for all you people that came up and said hello to me and, thank me for what, Kenny and I've done on Control Trends and Control Talk Now, man, can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Really appreciate you reaching out. It means a lot to me. So with that, like I said, we got a good show this week, but before we get to that, word from our sponsor this week. Hey, are you a systems integrator or controls company that's being held back by not having enough good technical people on staff? One of the problems that we share in building automation controls today is that we have lots of work, lots of potential jobs to quote, and we have really good people, but we have more jobs, more potential than we have people to do the jobs, which basically means we're walking away from business. And although we're trying to attract, hire, and train more techs, it's just not happening fast enough. Our sponsor this week can help. Innovative Control Tech Solutions, ICT, can help you take on more jobs and make more money. ICT has over 90 skilled engineers ready to step in and help get the job done. Whether it's taking off projects, working up quotes, doing submittals, doing control drawings, which can be really time consuming, programming jobs, or troubleshooting and even monitoring projects, they can help with it all. With ICT helping out your business with their experienced staff, you can take on more projects without any extra worries while still maintaining impressive customer service standards, and all at a very affordable price. It's pretty simple, really. The more work you quote, the more work you'll get. And with ICT doing a lot of the labor-intensive things, you'll be surprised at just how competitive you can be using ICT. So click on the link in the show notes to schedule a free consultation. And for a limited time, new customers can get a 10% discount on their first job. So stop walking away from business and start getting more jobs working with ICT. Hey, if you'd like to sponsor a Control Talk Now show, just click on the link in the show notes and we'll set you up. If you've got the product, I got the platform. Okay, so with that, let's get to our guest. All right, man, the one problem that's never, ever going to go away in our lifetime, and probably our kids and our great-grandkids' lifetimes, is cybersecurity. But fortunately for us, I got a fantastic guest today. This is his field. He's an expert at it. I'm so happy that our guest has taken a few minutes to speak with us today. His name is Osman Saleem. Thanks for taking some time to speak with us.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
And yeah, we got to see a little bit of you at Realcomm IBCon, and man, this is not your first rodeo. You've been on with Fred Gordy a couple of times in the past. Before we get too deep into the weeds, how about walking our audience through your journey into cybersecurity and smart building controls?
Excellent. Yeah, once again, thanks for having me, Eric. And yes, I have had the privilege of being on Control Talk before with Fred. So this is my second time. I'm a big fan of your work and all you're doing for the industry.
Thank you.
My career in smart buildings was not something that was chosen, really. It happened. I came here to Canada to study. And by education, I'm an electrical engineer. During my time in university, I did a couple of co-ops internships that were very different. So I worked in oil and gas for a summer up north in northern Alberta, worked in the oil fields over there. And then when I was done, I was thinking oil and gas, that's where I want to go. So came back the next year, I had another internship, and this was completely different. I got an internship with a company called Research in Motion. And for those that know, Research in Motion was at that time the parent company of BlackBerry, the phone.
That's right.
And it was at that time very popular. Everyone had a BlackBerry. It was very prevalent in business. And it was also picking up in the consumer market before Apple and Samsung wiped them out. But when I finished that internship, I was like, okay, telcos, telecom, wireless, that's the area that I'm going to go into. But somehow it happened that when I graduated, I didn't get into either field. I got into a designer / engineer role with Honeywell, designing building automation systems, not knowing what building controls was. It was a discipline that designing building automation control systems was a mix of more mechanical engineering knowledge that you needed about air systems and heat transfer and all of that. And a little bit electrical. But anyway, spent a little bit of time there to understand what I was doing. But it turned out to be a pretty productive time there. I did hardware design, where I would make design drawings for HVAC systems, working with all of Honeywell's product lines, from their building automation controls and to their industrial controls, programmed the sequences of operations into these controllers, and I also got to do a little bit of commissioning. And then from there, I moved into another space within smart buildings, and that was the world of fault detection and diagnostics, before it was called fault detection and diagnostics. So I was a building performance analyst for a while for a small company that's based in Canada here called Dymax Building Performance. And again, for those that know, if that name sounds familiar, Dymax Building Performance was the name of the company. And they were a spin-off, not really a spin-off, but they came from the world of building automation and controls, where in the 90s and the early 2000s, they would design building automation control systems that were called Dymax Controls. Some of your viewers might be familiar with that name, but they divested from that business and then moved into the world of collecting data from buildings. And then eventually that morphed into an FDD platform. So I did that for a while. And at that time, the industry wasn't as defined maybe as it is right now. Really what we were doing was we were collecting data from building automation systems, but then also other systems like lighting and metering. And we were doing what we could with it. So it was a little bit of fault detection. It was a little bit of supporting operations and being the helpline for them. It was supporting new construction projects, knowing what's happening live in the building. So it was a fascinating role in the sense that it really taught you how valuable data is.
Nice.
And what really you can do with it. You could literally reverse engineer how a building is operating. When you're looking at historical data, and you can really see. Again, we had a number of different hats there. And then I moved into consulting, and I've been in consulting since then. Where first I worked with a company, again, very familiar name, in Intelligent Buildings. I was with them for a number of years.
Okay. Tom and Rob and the crew? Yeah.
Rob, and the crew, yes.
Yeah. Is that where you met Fred? Gordy?
That's where I met Fred Gordy, correct. Okay. Had a great time there, learned a lot. And I was doing a lot of the work in the background with assessments, with strategy. And this is where I've expanded my knowledge from building automation systems and energy systems to pretty much anything related to smart buildings and sensors and security. And that's really where I got my first whiff of cybersecurity, where I was also helping Fred develop that practice at the time. And we were doing assessments. We were really finding out where the cybersecurity state of these buildings were, how mature they were, and weren't very mature at that time.
Yeah.
So I did that for a while. And then I moved into another role, which was now fully moving into cybersecurity. I moved to one of the big consulting companies in PricewaterhouseCoopers. And my role there was to lead their OT and IoT cybersecurity practice.
Okay.
And this was a little bit of a shift away from smart building industry and more into OT for critical infrastructure. And OT generally, in whatever form it was. And it was a role that where the main focus was cybersecurity, but we did some technology and strategy consulting as well. So I was there for a while, and that was my break from the smart building industry. And now I am, in a way, back into it.
Yes. It's pretty exciting. You've got a consulting business.
That is true. So yes, I do have my own consulting practice, and it's really built on the things that I've learned over the years.
Well, hang on, before we get into that, because we're going to talk about the consulting business, okay? But we got to unpack some of this stuff, because what a background you have. What a fantastic background. So I want to go back to the Honeywell when you were working on the industrial controls, and I'm assuming the flame safeguard controls with the fault detection specifically. My guess is, did you have anything to do with the UDC 3000 controllers that Honeywell had, the single loop controllers, or the RM 7800 flame safeguard controllers?
So on the industrial side, I worked heavily with the HC900 product.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Very innovative product. Okay.
Yeah, so I did work there. We did a lot of work. I did a lot of design with the Comfort Point product line.
Nice.
The Striker controller, Spider controller. So those are some of the things that I remember.
Yeah.
Designing them, programming them, and then helping the field engineers commission them.
And I think I bring that up for a reason, because I think it probably gives you a perspective on where control systems might be vulnerable, that people that maybe haven't designed control systems or controllers specifically might not have. Because if you understand fault detection, how to get data out, then you probably got a pretty good understanding of how you might try to get in if you were trying to get stuff out. Fair? Was that a fair statement?
Yes, that's true. As a designer, one of the things that you learn is how these systems work, how they communicate, and how they're set up. And back when I was a designer, I can tell you the number of times I heard cybersecurity was zero.
Yeah, zero. Yeah.
It just wasn't a focus.
Yeah, dude, I got to tell you real quick, let me just hop in and say this, because I remember I was out selling control systems back in the day. And I hate to admit this, but people who have been around for a while probably heard this. They would go, what are they going to do if they hack into your building automation control system? Steal your weather data, right? So people just didn't. So I think part of what you and Fred and Tom and Rob probably had trouble with back in the early days was getting people to take it seriously, that the building automation system could be a way that hackers could get in.
That's true. I think this was a common question, I would say 5-6 years ago, when we brought this topic up to building owners. The common question was, what's the worst that can happen? Or what are they going to do? And it's not so much that the leadership would say this, it was more the facility management.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can understand where they're coming from the perspective of operations. These folks are busy. They are continuously dealing with not just the dozen different systems that they have to keep the building running, but they're also acting as customer service representatives, where they're getting hot and cold calls, and so they're dealing with a lot. So cybersecurity was never really a focus. And traditionally, there's a long history here as to why cybersecurity was never a focus and why it never worked in the facility management space.
Yes.
And that's largely to do with the technology, right? It's any organization that is operating at scale has an IT department. Any organization that has an IT department has a cybersecurity practice or some form of it.
Yes.
And when they get involved in facilities, and when they get involved in OT, operational technology, it's just a different world. Priorities are different. The technology is different. And a lot of customers that we worked with tried to get their IT departments involved, but it never worked. And then what that ended up doing was that facility management even isolated themselves a little bit more.
Yes.
And then they would bypass their IT departments to get things going, because they weren't really judged on, or they weren't measured on whether the systems were secure. They were measured on running.
How many complaints did we get?
Exactly.
No, I remember, and I suspect you probably were in on a lot of these meetings too. I think back when Fred was with Tom and Rob, and when you were there too, one of their big, I think, value props, and one of the big things they had to do was they had to get the people in from the IT and the OT in the same room with the C-suite and get everybody on the same page, right? Because one hand didn't know what the other one was doing.
And that's a problem that goes on still. We still run into those discussions, and we still have the same sort of issues that continue to this day. But I think what we can be proud of as people in the smart building industry and folks who have a focus on cybersecurity is that I think now we don't have to justify why cybersecurity is important. I think we've raised enough awareness, and at times we've gone a little bit overboard. Quite frankly, I will say that as cybersecurity professionals, one of the things that we're guilty of is that aspect of fear, right? Oh, if you don't focus on this, your building's going to burn down. That's stretching the truth a little bit. But it was the way to raise awareness, because you really go with the worst case. Otherwise,
everybody's going to pay attention.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And now, as RealCom this year, cybersecurity was a big topic.
Yeah.
I believe it was my first RealCom, but I believe last year as well, it was a big topic. So it is a concern. And it's also a concern because there have been a lot of incidents. There's no reporting on these incidents, so no one knows. But if you loosely look at the stats that are available, in 2019, I believe it was Kaspersky, the antivirus company, that came up with a stat that 4 in 10 buildings had some sort of a cyber incident. Now, if you look at that 40%, that's a staggering number.
That is a staggering number for sure. And
I can tell you, in my time doing assessments over the years, and I've done dozens of assessments from small buildings to large, one of the things that you find out doing these assessments and talking to the FM staff is that figure is a 40% is probably low, as the actual numbers is higher. Because every other building I visited had some sort of an incident.
Yeah.
And whether it was harmless or innocuous, right? There was an incident where, for months, the facility management teams, they ran in shifts. So they thought the people at the other shift were changing parameters around, because the set points and the operating parameters never stayed the same.
Yeah, they didn't realize what was happening. Yeah,
they didn't realize, and this went on for weeks until in another building of that same property manager, like a massive attack happened. So they did an audit, a forensic analysis of all of their buildings.
Yeah.
And they found out that this particular building, where there were these harmless changes going on, there was actually some activity from some foreign device IP address that had somehow figured out the login credentials, which were, it was a generic password and username that the entire team was
using. Got to change those away, right? That's first step, right? You change the password.
And this was a few years ago. I think now that awareness has now changed practices now, and I think I wouldn't say that it's rare to find default usernames or generic usernames and passwords, but it's still a practice that is prevalent enough. But I would like to think it's not the norm.
Yeah. To me, I think the incident that took place years ago that I think got everybody's attention was the Target breach, the Target store breach. And I think that it got people's attention because it cost the brand so much, right? And I think that you got to the point, like you said, it might be pranks where people are coming in and changing set points and stuff like that. But once that happened, I think people begin to pay attention. I think the other thing that's going on, and you tell me, because you're the expert, I'm not, my guess is hackers are getting more and more sophisticated, probably using things like artificial intelligence. It's not like they're sitting still, because, I mean, if you're good at it, if you're going to do something illegal, that's probably your best bet, right? Biggest payoff, and you're probably not going to get shot. I think they invest a lot of time and money trying to figure out the latest technologies. And are you finding that to be true?
100%. I think AI in particular, I think is scary. But I think it's also scary because, again, it comes back to the point that I mentioned before. We as professionals in the security space, we tend to look at the worst case. But the way that the AI is being used now, it's almost like an assistant that can do days, if not weeks worth of work in minutes and hours.
Yes.
It is a tool that is in the toolkit of people who have malicious intent. And what we've done raising awareness about cybersecurity is, in turn, we've trained the AI itself, right? By publishing articles, by talking about it, and raising awareness has highlighted all the issues. It's had a good effect, an overall positive effect, obviously, but we always like to say that the threat actors, the people who have malicious intent, they're always one step ahead.
Yeah, I think it's
So
whether they are or not. I think that's a really safe assumption to make. If you're going to assume something, assume they're ahead, not behind, right?
definitely,
Yeah,
definitely.
and you're able to use things like AI too. You've got that in your toolkit too. The white hats have that in their toolkit too. I think it gets back to, again, I'm going to make a statement. You tell me if it's accurate or not. That you really need to have someone that's full time tracking the stuff and keeping up with it. And most companies don't, which I think really speaks to the fact that you really need to be working with an outside consultant as well as having your own internal people. If nothing else, you get a fresh set of eyes that comes in periodically. And so talk about that, if you will, because obviously with your consulting business, you do those sorts of things, right? Best practices. What are the mistakes or the misconceptions you're seeing clients of yours make that maybe are concerning to you? And then what are the best practices to make sure your facility is safe?
there's a few ways to answer that question, but let me start by saying that, yeah, it definitely helps to have an outside pair of eyes look at your facilities, look at your building, your systems, and really map out how these building systems are connected, how they communicate, who operates them, who your suppliers are, who your vendors are, who's accessing these systems, so on and so forth. So I think that definitely helps, and that needs to be a periodic exercise.
Yeah. So it's like most people go to the doctor once a year for a health checkup, right? You need to at least do it once a year, I think. Maybe more, but at least once a year, I would think.
That's a great analogy, right? And one of the things I'll say on that is that I think when we're talking about buildings, one of the things that facility managers and just folks in the facility management, building management industry can learn a lot from the folks, their cousins in critical infrastructure, right? Because in critical infrastructure, especially the highly regulated industries, they have this practice of routine assessments where they follow a framework that is industry standard. They keep coming back to this on a periodic level. And then they also have like windows where they have these assessments and they give themselves time to remediate some of the things that they found. And then in addition to that, whenever there are major changes, that assessment or a light touch of that happens again. So I find that these practices, when I started working with critical infrastructure clients, I found that they were much ahead in terms of cybersecurity practices.
Hang on real quick. I want to get some stable data from my audience. When you say critical, what was the word you used? Critical
infrastructure.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? So let's make sure they understand what you're talking about.
Critical infrastructure is a term to define specific industries that are deemed critical for the public.
Okay. Nuclear power plants.
Right. So nuclear, so energy, I think in general, right? Like power plants in general.
Right.
Think about manufacturing, maybe food manufacturing. That's pretty critical to any nation.
Absolutely.
Those are some examples. Water plants, for example. Utilities.
So their cybersecurity has probably stepped up a level or two, a notch or two, I'm guessing.
Definitely.
Okay.
And I think in the last couple of years, there has been a lot of progress from a legislative perspective where the U.S. government came out with critical infrastructure protection legislation, and I don't know exactly what it's called, but it really outlined the critical infrastructure industry. So I think they identified a couple dozen of them almost. And it had some of the ones that we've talked about right now, but it also had commercial real estate as one of them, as a critical infrastructure industry. And that's really sped up the in addition to the awareness that we've been trying to create for years, that's really stepped up industry to take this seriously.
Yes.
To have practices that they're now developed to a point where they're robust. Right. And manage the risk of a cybersecurity attack much more effectively and have a plan in place.
Yeah. Well, that makes so much sense. Is you've got a standard that works. You can follow a standard with people that have to. It's not optional for them. They have to make sure that their cybersecurity is top notch. Yeah. So cool. And so then having a plan. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. Just following on from that previous, U.S. did that, and then Canada followed suit. So it's been very interesting to see the progress and to see how now when you go into a C-suite meeting where you have senior leadership, it's not so much that you're bringing it to their attention. They need to focus on cybersecurity. They're like, okay, now we have this bill. that we have to adhere to, and there are penalties. So tell us what we have to do. I think that's helped. Legislation has helped a lot.
Nice.
In terms of first steps, failing to plan is planning to fail. So really, that's where you start, by having a plan on how to tackle cybersecurity. And I think that's where external consultants can help you. But there's also guidelines from industry frameworks, right? I think the first step is to develop policy, governance, some sort of a structure to what your cybersecurity program is going to be. And a very critical element of that, in addition to developing a policy, is understanding what you have. It's understanding what you have, who accesses it, and then really identifying what the criticality is of the systems that you have, of the buildings that you have. So one of the common practices, for example, in critical infrastructure, is that any organization that has systems that are deemed critical, right? So this could be a backup power. This could be a industrial process plant, for example. And I think I'm going to draw the parallel to buildings shortly. But a common practice is to go over the exercise of risk management, identifying what the criticality of a system is, identifying what happens if you lose it, understanding what are the consequences of that, and giving that. Now, there's various tools that we can use to quantify that, right? But having some objectivity around that risk, I think really helps give leadership a clear path. Okay, these are the areas that we need to focus on. And then you can drill down into, okay, what are the measures that you need to take? In buildings, for example, it is possible that your cooling plant, for example, is more critical than your heating, because you have data centers that if they lose cooling, then you're going to have problems. That's an example of identifying which systems you have, and also factoring in what sort of a building it is, what sort of tenants you have, and what their requirements are, right? So for some tenants that have just building on data centers, if they have data centers, your cooling plant is going to be critical for that. For others, it might be physical security, it might be the access control system. For others that want experience, it might be something else. It might be an occupant experience system. So that exercise of risk management, I think, it includes identifying these systems, quantifying the risk somewhat, and then really going over what sort of risk are you willing to take. Because in the OT world, we need to keep buildings running. We need to keep these physical processes running. And it usually boils down to the fact that you're willing to take on a hit as long as it isn't affecting your operations. So I think that whole practice falls into that planning part. And I think that's where you start.
Yeah, I got to just hop in and use another analogy. My oldest daughter worked for one of the big accounting firms, and all the companies, and I'm saying this is an analogy because we get a lot of end users that listen, and they're very familiar with the concept of part of her deal was once a year they came in and they did an audit, a full audit, the expenses, everything. And they did that for a couple reasons. Number one, it's not that they didn't have people in house doing that, because they did, but it gave them another layer of protection, a fresh set of eyes, so that if there was a mistake, most of these were publicly traded companies, but by having an outside set audit, it ensured the safety of investors' money. I like the idea of thinking of this in terms of an audit for the owners out there that are thinking in terms of their buildings and their properties is, hey, bring somebody in like you would if an outside accounting firm to do an audit, help with the plan, and it needs to be an ongoing thing, I think.
Let me give you an example, right? In the utilities world, this is common practice where you will have cybersecurity assessments on IT and OT once every 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
And in between that time period, what's going to happen is that they're going to work on everything that they've identified in those in that assessment, and they're going to work on remediation. So that's a window, but it's not like they're doing an assessment every 2 years. That's their frequency, but then they're conducting other ones in the middle as well when there's large changes that happen. Let's say
so the audit says, hey, we're vulnerable here. So the next 2 years, if I'm hearing you right, then the next 2 years, you're taking steps to do that. So when you do the next audit, you go, okay, we got that one checked out. What's the next place we're vulnerable? So it's constantly improving or hardening the system.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely.
All right, go
I
ahead.
mean, and sorry to cut you off. One thing I'll say also is that, having an overarching policy that guides your action, right? I think that's important too.
Yes.
And this frequency and what's covered and what you need to do, that needs to be outlined in a policy, and that's one of the first steps. But policies are funny because they're documents that sit in your server somewhere,
Yeah.
and it's really about the action, right? So
Right.
if you were to ask me what's better, is it having a policy or doing the action? I'd say probably anything that is an action that actually
Yeah.
does something is better. But I
Right.
think having that policy helps because if
Well,
your
you know what to
organization is
do.
large enough, you
Yeah.
need some sort of a guideline.
Okay, now listen, I know we're going to have listeners out there that are going, all right, I like this guy. How do customers engage with you? Talk about your business, what you do, and how do people find you, and what's the first step to engaging you?
Yeah, so my practice really focuses on its OT consulting. And the way that I like to think about it is 3 and 3. So we focus on 3 industries, and then there are 3 key areas that I think are really essential when it comes to these industries. So 3 industries are smart buildings, smart cities, and critical infrastructure.
Okay.
And then there's other industries in them. And the 3 areas of focus that I have are, firstly, on the strategy side, how to develop your OT technology and cybersecurity strategy, taking your business goals and objectives and tying them to technology outcomes, or doing it the other way around, depending on the situation. So that's one area. The second area is developing the digital architecture, which includes connectivity, network, what that architecture is going to look like, how systems communicate with one another. So having that blueprint of your OT in your building and in your organization at large, I think that really helps pave the way forward for firstly understanding what you have and then what you need to improve on. And the last thing is technology assessments and cybersecurity assessments. That's how I like to think about it. 3 industries and then those 3
best
areas,
practices
of practices. Yeah.
Okay, so how do people engage you? What's the step? What's the first step?
I'm active on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach me over there. And I can share my email with you that you can include as well.
Yeah, we'll put that in the list.
Definitely.
So for sure.
That's probably the best way to reach me. And my website right now is being revamped at the moment, but that will be shortly online soon. So
perfect.
You can find out what we do there.
So I'm assuming that once they get hold of you, you have an initial phone call and assess what their needs are and assess what you can do. And then from there, work up a proposal. Is that kind of how?
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah, I am very open to having discussions and just understanding. I'm very curious about what organizations are doing, where they're at with technology. And yeah, I'm very happy to have a call, chat, see what you're up to, and understand about your organization. And then if there's a need that your organization has that I can help out with, happy to discuss that too.
That sounds great. Hey, great job. Appreciate it. Okay.
No, thanks for having me, man. And yeah, let's continue this discussion. And then I think for next time, let's do it again in a few months.
Sounds great, my friend. All the best. So there you go. That's another week on Control Talk Now. Really appreciate you tuning in. Special thanks to our sponsor this week, ICT, and our guest this week, Osman Saleem. With that, remember, be bold, stay in control, stay relevant. Sonner Thompson used to say, buy the ticket, take the ride. And as Kenny Smyers used to say, indeed. We'll see you next week.